There's a lot of misunderstanding about dopamine. So dopamine is usually understood to be a neurotransmitter involved in reward and pleasure, but it is not actually. 80% with depression are never diagnosed. 1/3 don't respond to treatment. 1/3 they don't find relief. So when suffering happens, the immediate question was, who is suffering? And this is the most fascinating part of being a scientist.
Hello and welcome to Whose Race Are You Running? I'm Sia and I'm here to talk about you. In talking about you today, we're going to continue with the conversation on Indian wisdom tradition practices and the neuroscience behind it with Dr. Saketh. Everybody's experience of stress is different based on, like you said, probably their memory and exposure to whatever life situations they have been exposed to. So if I were to take an example, like for example, we'll take the colleague example. If a colleague has walked past and who I do not like, and that has triggered my heart rate to go up and all of that before I have seen the colleague. Right. And then I see the colleague and then I am stressed now because whatever was going on, let's give it a context. Let's say I came out and my boss said a few things to me that were not pleasant or likable or agreeable with me. And then I see the colleague go across. Now I am already bodily
stressed out,
psychologically, brain-wise also in a movement of sorts. Unpleasant for sure. But everything is happening. Now, a thought or a perception, if I am to say, has activated one whole system which was originally only meant for, let's say, a bear was attacking
unconscious perception. Mostly, it is unconscious perception.
That also. So, okay, it's getting very complicated. Okay, so the bear that was otherwise attacking me in a normal situation is this response, this entire stress response has come about now by me just thinking that a colleague may have done something because of which my boss said a few bad things to me.
Correct.
Right? Now, that is not going to go. Unlike the bear, which is going to go away, this thought is going to stay with me for some time in my state.
Thought loop is...
I am assuming. But why is it that the thought can't come back down? Like, why does it happen that that thought continues and therefore then the response just continues?
Yes, I would be very straightforward with this response. That's because we have not learned from our childhood. There are no interventions in place in our educational institutions, in our families, in our communities, in our society, how to handle thought. How to handle thought, how to handle emotion. So thoughts and emotions are our thoughts. Just like the body is mine, even the mind is mine. It's my mind, it's my body, it's my thought, it's my emotion. So why is my thought, my emotion not happening consciously, the way I want it to happen? Why is it just happening all the time, unconsciously, automatically, going on and on all the time? That's because we have not learned how to handle thought. It's as straightforward as a response. After working on this, after spending 6 to 7 years trying to understand what is really happening within us which makes us feel stressed out, this is the answer. It's like a tool which we have not learned how to use it.
On a side note, does thought create the emotion or does the emotion come first?
As I said, the brain's primary job is to keep the body alive. And physiological situations determine what kind of thoughts we experience and what kind of emotions we experience. At the same time, what kind of thoughts we have and what kind of emotions we have influence the physiological reactions in the body. So it's like a loop. It's like a never-ending loop of thought and physiological response influencing thought and emotion. So coming back to your question on thought and emotion, how are they linked? So in reality, thought and emotion are very, very closely linked. So when thought happens, it can trigger the emotional reactions. When there is an emotional reaction, our ability to think logically comes down. When we say angry, or when we are in state of fear, it's an intense emotional reaction. That's when it's a common usual experience that during that time we can't think rationally. We tend to take hasty decisions. So it's a classic case of emotion influencing the thought. Similarly, when we are thinking in a particular way, say a colleague passing by, you thought about it and thought goes on, that can set off an emotional reaction within you. So it's kind of very, very closely connected, thought and emotion. Earlier we were discussing about this affect, right? Affect and interoception and all these things. So emotion is very closely linked with affect. So the information which is going from the body, that's basically what we call as interoception, and how you feel, that is affect. So this, the brain has to interpret now. For example, I'm feeling in a particular way. What is this feeling about? I'm feeling good right now. What is this feeling about? This, the brain tries to interpret based on the current context and memory. And then it bases on this understanding and constructs an emotion. It constructs an emotion, anger, fear, happiness. This is a construction by the brain out of the current context, the past memory, and the physiological condition within the body. So all of this come together for emotion to happen.
And that also explains then why the colleague passing is not a threat that I thought up. It feels extremely real, and it
Correct.
feels like I may die because that colleague, crossed the whatever corridor. Because actual life-threatening situations are not that many, but most of the stress that is then experienced seems like it is more with playing somewhere between thought and emotion, creating that kind of a stress, and that stress feels like it is extremely real.
That's right.
Now, that being the continuous state of a person, how does it impact the physiological body?
If we just look at the way we act when we are stressed out. We are stressed out, so we want to escape from stress. And what we do? We eat food which is not good for the system. We tend to become more lazy, or sedentary lifestyle kicks in. We might take alcohol, we might smoke. So, and then that creates more stress, because stress, as I said, has a physiological roots to it. All of these things, food, nutrition, and you're stressed out, you can't sleep well. So then all of these things will change the physiological system, and then you will perceive more stress. And more stressed you feel, more these things go wrong. Food and exercise, everything. So it's a complex cycle, it's a vicious cycle which has to be halted somewhere. So there are 5 very, very important factors when it comes to health and well-being. Which if it goes wrong, we are likely to have many diseases and disorders. One is food, nutrition. Nutrition is the most very core aspects of our body. Then sedentary lifestyle or lack of physical activity, smoking, alcohol, sleep, lack of quality sleep, and stress. So these are the 5 factors which can cause multiple diseases, ranging from anxiety. Somebody is stressed out, they're more likely to have anxiety and depression at a later period of time. So all of these 5 factors interact in a very complex way to give rise to chronic lifestyle disorders like anxiety, depression, even cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer. All of these are very, very closely linked with these 5 factors. And among these 5 factors, I would say stress is the most important factor. Chronic stress is implicated in 8 of the 10 leading causes of death. Me feeling stressed out nothing much can be done. There's a lot of unconscious activity which is making me feel stressed out this moment. But how I act after that is still in my hands. The brain and body responding to a colleague passing by and setting off a stress response is not in my hands, as of now at least. It's a lot of memory to it and a lot of unconscious processing happening. But once the stress response happens and once I feel stress, what can I then do? That is where conscious response comes into picture. Can I respond consciously to the feeling of stress, or do I go and react unconsciously as I did previously? If I react unconsciously as I did previously, that will only enhance the patterns of stress. If I respond consciously to the feeling of stress, then the pattern or the cycle becomes weaker. And if I keep on activating this conscious response over a period of time, all the brain networks which are involved in this conscious response become more and more stronger. And all the brain networks which are involved in the unconscious stress reactions, they become weaker and weaker. And then a point comes when even the unconscious reaction won't happen. A colleague passing by is just a colleague passing by. It doesn't create the stress response anymore. So this is the whole aspect of how we can transform a simple situation into something which will create well-being for us.
Let's talk about the brain basis then of anxiety and depression. What is the subjective experience and what is happening in the body in anxiety and depression?
So when we actually talk about terms like anxiety and depression, we most often use it in a very light way. He's depressed. Probably he's not depressed. He's just a little sad.
Down. Yeah.
Being sad is not equivalent to being depressed. So depression is a biological disorder with deep roots in the body. And it's, according to statistics, the number one or number two leading cause of disability in the world. If you're chronically stressed out, then it makes you much more vulnerable to an anxious or depressive episode later in your life, especially if you have early life stress. So there are 3 developmentally sensitive periods in the human life. One is early infancy, adolescence, childhood, and adolescence.
Early infancy would be
Like
5.
0 to 2 years,
Okay.
kind of that period. 10% of the pregnant women experience, 10 to 15% actually, experience maternal depression. And maternal depression can increase the risk of depression in the child much later in life. Because if the mother is depressed, she is much less likely to give the right kind of care for the child. At the same time, the chemistry, if the woman is pregnant, if she is depressed during that time, even that can influence the brain development pathways, the developmental pathways in the brain of the child who is not yet born. And this can put the child at risk when he's an adult. So it's really important to understand the root cause of it. Because the root cause of it is not, what happened in the last month or the previous year. The root cause goes down to your very early stages of life. I would say the first 18 years of life is so crucial. So crucial. I cannot really emphasize how important it is, because the brain is most plastic in the first 18 years of life. So in the early infancy, the child is really, the perception is very unclear. There's no face perception. It's just information coming into the child. A child, just born child, can't perceive face. They can't perceive anything. It's just tsunami. It's just information floating all around. And then over a period of time, the baby learns, okay, this is my mother. The face is like this, based on information processing happening. And then learns about color, learns about distance, depth evaluation happens, size, texture. All of these things come slowly over a period of time. So this first 2 years can shape the brain of the infant to a large extent. And in this first 2 years, brain is forming synapses. Synapses are the tiny junctions between the neurons. So neurons are the fundamental units of the nervous system, and neurons communicate with each other. Information passes from one neuron to the other neuron. There's a gap between these neurons that's called a synapses. That's where the neurotransmitters are released and they pass the message to the next neuron. So these synapses are very important for the communication to propagate, information to propagate. And the synapses are also important for memory, learning, everything. If memory is strong, that means the synaptic connection is very strong. So what is happening in early infancy is that it's a period of immense growth. An infant is forming 2 million synapses per second. He's forming 2 million synapses per second. So it's like taking in all the information from the world, trying to make patterns out of it. That's why it's so easy for an infant to pick up language. Pick up multiple languages at the same time, 4 to 5 languages, how many ever that is. But it's very difficult for an adult to pick up language because brain has become less plastic with age.
By plastic, you mean
plastic, the
developing, like
plasticity is ability to flexibly adapt. So brain, the most fascinating feature of the brain is it's plastic in nature. That is, not very long back, we had this understanding that brain is a very rigid thing. It doesn't change with age. But now, because of advances in neuroscience in the last many 50, 60 years, we now know that brain is plastic. It changes continuously with what it is experiencing. It adapts flexibly to the changing environments. Now, this first 2 years is so crucial, and 2 million synapses are forming every second. Huge amount of information is being processed. And then after 2 years, what happens is information is already there. A lot of information, a lot of synapses are there. Now something called as pruning happens. The synapses get pruned. So the first thing is called as tuning. Information is tuned, and then after 2 years, information is pruned. It's cut down.
So you were mentioning shapes, colors, texture, all of that. Also emotions and
everything,
feelings,
actually. Everything is the root causes are happening at that point of time. So this reminds me of what happened in Romania. So in 1960s, a Romanian dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. So what he did was he wanted to make Romania a great economic power. And for that, he wanted a lot of population. More population, more economy. That was his understanding. And because of which he banned abortion. He banned contraceptives. So there was a law in place for couples to have at least 5 kids.
Oh.
There was something called as celibacy tax. If you have less than 5 kids, you have a tax to pay. There were menstrual police who are going around and checking if couples have enough babies. That was the situation during that point of time. And because of which, a lot of couples were not able to afford having 5 kids. And a lot of kids were put in these orphanages. Lot of lakhs of kids ended up in orphanages. And these orphanages were state-run orphanages, and they did not have proper facilities. It was just physical things were taken care of. Food was given, and other things, physical things were taken care of. But there was no emotional support. There was no nurturing, which is very important to happen at that point of time. There was no bonding happening between the mother and the children, because of which a lot of these kids ended up having emotional difficulties. They picked up language much later. They had cognitive difficulties. They had difficulties forming social connections. So all of this surfaced when researchers looked at what happened with these kids in the orphanages. And what's interesting is that if a kid is in that kind of state, if you take them back to a foster home, that can recover the damage that has happened.
Oh.
And what's even more interesting is that at what age you take them back to the foster homes. The later it is, the
tougher
less
it
the
gets.
recovery. The younger it is, the quicker the time is, the more the recovery that happens in the kid.
Just out of curiosity, in these studies, were the kids who were not nurtured in that sense, did they show any physical disabilities or?
Yes, the brains were
Smaller?
thinner,
Oh.
they're smaller, they had language difficulties, they had cognitive difficulties, their motor learning was slower, everything was delayed, and also mental health difficulties. So because this is all very interconnected. Your brain health is not good, your mental health is likely not to be good. So childhood, adolescence also very, very important. Adolescence is the time wherein they are more risk-taking. But the important parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it's not fully developed. So there's a very important part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex called as dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's very important for decision making, judgment, reasoning, all these things. It is still underdeveloped in teens. Because it is underdeveloped in teens, they are more likely to take hasty decisions. The prefrontal cortex has not developed until the age of 25, 30 actually. Full maturation doesn't happen until the age of 25.
And you mentioned maternal depression. These conversations just make it so much more important to recognize depressive states in
Much
people,
earlier in life.
because the pain of that is just gone unnoticed.
Unnoticed, that's right.
I'm assuming maternal depression is not something any mother is willing upon herself. It is something she is going through, and it is something to be so compassionate about.
Exactly.
And also for the people around to recognize that there is something going on here that is beyond her control. And that needs care.
Exactly. Care and compassion.
And it needs intervention. It needs people to look at that situation with a lot of love, care, and support, so that both mother and baby eventually,
Lead a healthy life.
come out and be healthy. Just identifying and recognizing that, okay, there's something going on here, something sensitive that requires some kind of attention and care is just so important, so that human life carries on like life.
Right.
From my understanding, there seems to be only 2 or 3 ways of how to learn what to do with our thoughts and emotions now that we are adults. One seems to be obviously psychiatry and psychotherapy. These two are now becoming mainstream, thankfully. And then, of course, the third one, which I'm most excited to talk about, which we will get into in very great detail, which is the ancient wisdom traditions of what our ancestors have been telling us for, like, I don't know how many years, ever since the prefrontal cortex developed, I think. So how does psychology look at handling thought, emotion, or is that a route actually to learn how to handle our mental construct better, if I may put it that way?
Prevention, promotion, treatment are 3 different things. When we are at the stage of treatment, as you said, there are multiple options available. For example, psychotherapy, which is a psychological training, some form of training wherein you learn to how to relate to your thoughts and emotions. And then there is pharmacology, drugs and different forms of treatment, chemical treatment, which can change the chemistry in the brain and can make you come out of depression or anxiety, whatever it is. And then third way is the ancient wisdom traditions, which again play a massive role. Coming to your question about how psychology and psychiatry work with these things, again, psychiatry and psychology help only at the treatment stage. It's very important to understand that. The most important problem is prevention and promotion. That's the most critical aspect, which is what we need to work on. But it's very important to also work in an integrative manner when it comes to treatment. So let us come to psychology and psychiatry. There's a massive treatment gap of 80% in India. There are 0.3 psychiatrists per 1 lakh population. There are 4,000 clinical psychologists per 1 lakh, not per 1 lakh, overall in the country. If we have such a low number of psychologists and psychiatrists, how can we really treat this many people? That's the first problem. Second problem is lack of awareness of what mental health is. I'm anxious, I'm depressed. I don't even know that I'm having anxiety, depression. So lack of awareness. Third, if I'm aware of the situation which I'm facing, whom do I access? This is the accessibility problem. I don't know whom to access because it's far away. And fourth is stigma. If I want to access, say there's a psychiatric hospital, and what would my family say if I want to go to a psychiatric hospital? There's a huge stigma associated with all these things. So all these four things make it very, very difficult right now to really work on the mental health challenge that we have. And I think that's where digital interventions play a very big role. Digital interventions, at the same time integrating mental health care into the primary healthcare system. These two things will play a massive role in working on how we treat mental health disorders. 80% with depression are never diagnosed. 1/3 don't respond to treatment. 1/3, they don't find relief. 1/3 are the ones who find relief. Out of the 1/3, 50% of the individuals have intolerable side effects, because of which they go off the medication. So it's a very tiny proportion of the population who are getting benefited with this medication, and medication has side effects. Medication should not be given, it's not ideal to be given below 18 years because the brain is still very, very plastic. It should be the last line of treatment for these individuals. You should try psychotherapy, you should try anything else actually apart from the medication at this point of
under
time.
18.
Under 18 years of age. Depression has various stages, so from mild to moderate to severe depression with different kind of symptoms and how intense the symptoms are and all those things. Now what is happening with depression is that there are three defining features of somebody who's depressed. One is there is anhedonia. Anhedonia is inability to feel pleasure. It's the lack of pleasure which a person feels. We talked about hedonic well-being, right? So hedonic well-being is about hedonia. Anhedonia is inability to feel pleasure. That's a defining feature of depression. You don't feel good. You don't feel like, normal activities which give pleasure to a lot of others don't give you pleasure anymore. You don't feel like going out and doing things and all those stuff. Next, there is rumination. This excessive rumination which happens. You keep on thinking about the sad stuff over and over again. It's a loop. You can't come out of it. It's called as thought stickiness. It seems like thought has stuck to you. You just don't know how to come out of this sticky thought. It feels so real. It feels so uncontrollable. It's going on and on all the time. And that leads to the third defining feature, which is called as psychomotor retardation, which is everything slows down. Energy is low. You feel fatigue. You don't feel motivation to go around because you lack energy. Basically, energy comes down. And then there are also other features like, the cognitive difficulties which people face. There is excessive feeling of guilt and grief, all these things. Now, these three features have three different pathways: anhedonia, rumination, and psychomotor retardation. And these three pathways are what the drugs target. So if you talk about, and that's where neurotransmitters come into the picture. So if we try to understand the chemistry of this, we can have the right interventions and right treatments in place. If you talk about, start with rumination. The brain pathway, which is implicated in this is the serotonergic pathways. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter which transmits the information from one neuron to other neuron. First neuron, it's triggered, information passes, releases serotonin. Serotonin in the synapse, serotonin goes and binds to a receptor in the next neuron and passes the information. That's what is happening in the brain throughout, different neurotransmitters playing. Now, what is happening in depression is that the serotonin levels go down in the synapse.
And serotonin is
Serotonin
for
is
what?
important for mood, and rumination is implicated in that pathway. Now, when serotonin goes down, that's when a person is likely to feel low mood. So the common drugs for depression called as SSRIs, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now what happens is the serotonin, once it's released into the synapse, it binds. This serotonin is taken back, is recycled to the previous neuron, is either recycled or broken down. So when it's being recycled, that pump which recycles the serotonin back to the previous neuron is blocked by antidepressants. Because it is blocked by antidepressants, serotonin is available for longer period of time.
And serotonin staying in the system uplifts
the mood, but only in 1/3 of the people.
Oh.
Because serotonin levels in the brain body go up within minutes to hours. But antidepressants take many weeks to be effective. You feel the effects of antidepressants after many weeks actually. So what is happening really? Instantly brain serotonin goes up, but it doesn't translate to relief of symptoms. And that led to the understanding that serotonin is not the only neurotransmitter which is involved in depression. There are other neurotransmitters which are also involved, which are equally important. So the second neurotransmitter which is important is norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is the one which leads to arousal. We talked about the whole circle. Arousal is one of the important axes. So norepinephrine is involved in arousal, because of which...
Can we just redefine arousal once more?
Energy. You can take over energy. Energy is lower, and because of which you don't feel like going around.
Engaging in.
That's psychomotor retardation part. And now, again, drugs target this pathway. So that's the second neurotransmitter. Third neurotransmitter, I think a lot of us are very fascinated about, is dopamine.
Absolutely.
So it's probably the most well-known neurotransmitter in the world right now. It's all about dopamine hacks and dopamine everything.
Yes, it's all about dopamine and dopamine cycles. Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about it anyway, assuming there are people who do not know about dopamine.
No, there's a lot of misunderstanding about dopamine. So dopamine is usually understood to be a neurotransmitter involved in reward and pleasure, but it is not actually. Dopamine plays a role in anticipation of pleasure. It plays a role in anticipation of reward and not reward per se. Reward and pleasure, actually it's endorphins which play a role. Dopamine is working at an anticipatory level. For example, there are these amazing experiments in rats wherein you show a light and the rat has to press a lever and then it gets a reward. It gets some food. You show a light, it has to press a lever, it gets food as a reward. Now, if you keep training the rat like this, what happens is that the moment light flashes, dopamine goes up.
So they don't need to press the lever, it goes up at the light itself.
At the light itself. So they're anticipating the pleasure. Dopamine doesn't release after the reward comes. Initially, when the rat is not trained, that's when the dopamine goes up with reward. But over a period of time, dopamine tends to decrease more and more with actual reward. It goes up and up with the anticipatory thing. Light goes up, dopamine goes up. So this spiking of dopamine, which happens with anticipation of pleasure, is lower in depression. They can't anticipate pleasure also. That's why it's so difficult to you don't feel like doing anything. So these three neurotransmitters play a big role. And coming to the brain circuitry underlying all these things, dopamine, there's this brain circuitry which is called as the mesolimbic dopamine system. I'm not mentioning these brain regions, which is like not required necessarily.
Does not matter, yeah.
Yeah, it does not matter really. So that two brain regions which are important for dopamine secretion to happen. Now, these two brain regions are inhibited by amygdala. So amygdala is another very important player in this whole stress, anxiety, depression dialogue. So this amygdala inhibits the reward system.
Amygdala is a part of the brain.
It's a part of the brain which inhibits the dopamine system. Now, because of this inhibition happening, you don't feel pleasure. You don't feel that anticipatory pleasure as well. Now, there's another brain region which inhibits the amygdala. That's your prefrontal cortex. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the highest, the most evolved brain region of ours, that keeps a check on the amygdala. And this is lower in people who are depressed. They are not able to inhibit the amygdala, which is leading to lower pleasure and reward. Because of that, it becomes a habit, basically. And how can you train your prefrontal cortex to inhibit the amygdala? I think that's where ancient Western traditions come into picture, and meditation as a tool and all those things. But basically, it's this circuitry along with other circuitry like the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, HPA axis. All these things play a complex role and then give rise to this feeling of depression, which is a very, very real biological thing. It's not something which is, people are not facing really. It's as real as diabetes. At the same time, psychology is important. We just talked about the biology of it. So biology, psychology, both play a role and interact with each other to predispose an individual to depression. And then we go to the next level, social level. So biological level, psychological level, social level. What kind of circumstances, the environment around you. All of these things influence the psychology and biology. So it's often called as biopsychosocial disorder with complex features influencing each other in many, many different ways. That's why it's so difficult to pinpoint this is the factor. We need to have interventions in different stages of life. That's why policymakers play a very crucial role in having the right policies at the right time.
So, the diagnosis of depression is still clinical, right? It's by a clinician.
Correct.
You do not have any biological markers as of today that I know of.
Correct.
To diagnose depression.
That's right.
That's saying a lot about how complicated a condition it is to not have.
Correct. It's not still relied on subjective reports.
And how is anxiety different from depression?
Anxiety, you could say, very simple terms, anxiety is anhedonia plus hypervigilance. Depression is anhedonia plus hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is basically you are more vigilant about what is happening around you. So we talked about earlier how body is perceiving things, body and brain are perceiving things before you consciously perceive. So there are two fundamental pathways in how information is processed by the brain. Again, it's a very metaphorical thing, but you could say one is the fast pathway, one is the slow pathway. So all the information that comes to the brain goes through these two pathways. The fast pathway is the one which directly goes to the amygdala. So usually what happens when information comes in, visual information or auditory information, whatever it is, it has to go through this particular region called as thalamus. And then it goes to the higher brain regions like the cerebral cortex. This is the slow pathway because it takes more time. And the fast pathway is the one which bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to the amygdala. And that's the reason something happens, you immediately react. Before the conscious awareness comes, oh, I reacted. So anxiety kind of predisposes to depression, or anxiety depression can happen together. Anxiety and stress also are linked. So anxiety is about something which is uncertain. You don't have a specific reason why anxiety happens, but stress has a very specific stressor. This specific stressor, if you keep having that chronic stress, can lead to a state wherein you become anxious about just about nothing actually. And what is happening again, this particular brain region, amygdala, is very important, plays a very important role in anxiety as well. So this brain region gets triggered by just normal things in people who are anxious. Something which is non-threatening can trigger the activation of amygdala, and that can set off the whole reaction.
In subjective experience, it would feel like you're constantly alert.
You're triggered by small things. You are on an alert mode. Okay, what might happen wrong? Scientists have observed expansion of amygdala. It expands in people who are anxious and depressed, and it shrinks in people who are lifelong meditators. They have a smaller amygdala compared to people who are depressed and anxious.
So let's go into it then, because I think it's about time. All the psychological stressors that we're talking about, which triggers your stress response system continuously as a result of all the things that we spoke about, childhood, adolescence, and all the experiences of life, comes back to the very simple thing that you said, which is we do not know how to handle our thoughts and emotions, and we're not taught that. So what do the wisdom traditions tell us? What have we not understood or been taught in our lives that we need to know?
Yeah, it's actually quite simple. If you look at the whole problem, it's quite simple. We have spent a lot of resources on understanding the science of it, but we are not spending enough resources on preventing and promoting it, and preventing mental illness and promoting well-being. We have not spent resources, on this crucial part, and that's because we do not have insights from the ancient wisdom traditions integrated with modern medicine in a very, very deep manner. It's happening here and there, but it's still not integrated to a large extent. And the integration has not happened with organizations, with educational institutions, and all these things. I've worked on trying to understand how meditation, yoga as a practice, pranayama can modulate the brain, can bring about plasticity, can bring about changes in cognition and well-being. How does these things happen? This is what I have looked into, objectively in the last, in my PhD work. And it's fascinating because if you just look back at our history, thousands of years back, people knew how to overcome suffering. People knew how to overcome suffering. People knew that suffering is real. And then they looked into themselves to understand what the roots of suffering are. And then they provided methods by which we can overcome suffering. If you talk about the 4 noble truths of Buddha, these are the 4 noble truths. The first is suffering is real. Second is, suffering exists and it's real. Second is, there's a way out of suffering. And third and fourth give the methods to overcome suffering. So this all started with that simple question about who am I? What is the nature of my reality? So when suffering happens, the immediate question was, who is suffering? And this is the most fascinating part of Being a scientist, I can talk about these things, and it's really exciting for me as a person.
Let's go into it all. It's very exciting.
So this whole question about suffering starts with this one simple question: I'm suffering. And if you look at suffering, what is suffering? Suffering at a very fundamental level. So we talked about affect, how you feel. Suffering, be it any kind, stress, anxiety, depression, whatever it is, it's a form of suffering. And suffering is an unpleasant experience. You don't feel good. And it's an uncontrollable thing. You know suffering is not good. You don't feel to be in that state, but you don't know how to come out of it. That's it's at the very core of what suffering is. And now people have looked into, thousands of years back, who is the person who is suffering? What is creating suffering? And that's the quest which led to developing methods. Yoga is all about methods. It provides methods which are very systematic and very precise in how they work. And that helps in person overcoming suffering. It's very important, because here we are not talking about coping with suffering. Here we are not talking about coping with stress. Here we're talking about transcending stress. Here we're talking about transcending suffering. And how does it happen? That's the whole story of yoga. That's the whole story of meditation. Anger is a very, very unconscious reaction. If you really go into the core of how it is arising, you can actually realize that the moment the anger arises, if you can notice it, the anger doesn't have much power. So what yoga is doing is, it's bringing in the right balance between excitation and inhibition in the brain. What pranayama is doing is, because you cannot consciously work on your mind so easily. Working on the mind is difficult, but working on the breath is easier. And breath is linked with the mind. What we see from neuroscience is that the sense of individual self that we have, which is so strong within most people, this sense of self is an illusion.